What if the worst customer you ever served was also the key to unlocking your wildest dreams? For one waitress, a single note scribbled on a napkin changed everything. This isn't a fairy tale. This is a story about how a flash of forgotten genius in a noisy Austin taqueria caught the attention of a man who didn't just see a waitress. He saw a solution to an impossible problem. It's a story of a cryptic equation, a private jet ticket, and a test so demanding it could shatter her or forge her into the person she was always meant to be. The smell of sizzling carnitas and burnt chili was the perfume of Elena Ramirez's life. It clung to her hair, her cheap polyester uniform, and the weary lines around her 24-year-old eyes. She worked at El Fuego Lento, a taqueria in a rapidly gentrifying Austin neighborhood, a place that served authentic, greasy-spoon comfort food to a clashing clientele of tech bros and local families. It was a purgatory for the city's aspiring musicians, artists, and in Elena's case, forgotten prodigies. Each morning she would tie her apron, the strings frayed from 1,000 shifts, and paste on a smile that rarely reached her eyes. She was good at her job, efficient, polite, and almost invisible. The perfect waitress. No one arguing about their startup's valuation or complaining about the spice level of their salsa would ever guess that Elena could architect a neural network or debate the ethics of artificial intelligence. No one knew that 3 years ago she had been a top engineering student at Caltech, living a life coded in the vibrant language of her dreams. Then came the phone call. Her father's stroke, the collapse of his small electronics repair shop, the mountain of unforeseen medical debt. Her dream dissolved overnight. She flew home, leaving behind the sun-drenched quads of Pasadena for the cracked pavement of a tiny East Austin apartment she now shared with her friend Sophia. Caltech became a ghost, a painful whisper of a life that belonged to someone else. "2 barbacoa, 1 al pastor," barked Marco, the cook, his voice a gravelly roar over the sizzle of the flat-top grill. Elena grabbed the heavy plates, the heat warming her forearms. "Gracias, Marco." She moved through the cramped taqueria with a practiced grace, weaving between tables. Table 7 was her nemesis today, a man in a pinstripe suit, probably in his late 40s, who had already sent back his horchata because it wasn't organically sourced. His name was Mr. Davies, and he was trying desperately to impress his much younger date. "And make sure the tacos are authentic," he'd ordered earlier, snapping his fingers. "Not Tex-Mex. I want true interior Mexican cuisine." "Got it, sweetheart." In the far corner booth, a man sat alone. He was different from the usual tech crowd. He wasn't on his phone or trying to be seen. He was just watching, nursing a single Mexican Coke. He was dressed in worn jeans, a faded band t-shirt, and scuffed boots, looking more like a roadie than a CEO. But there was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a focused stillness that felt out of place. Every time she passed, she felt his observant eyes on her. It wasn't creepy, just analytical. Suddenly a commotion erupted near the front. Mr. Davies was on his feet, loudly berating the busboy for spilling a drop of water. As he ranted, he gestured wildly, knocking a leather-bound journal off his own table. It fell open, and a napkin with complex equations and schematics fluttered to the floor. "Look what you made me do!" he bellowed. Elena sighed and went to defuse the situation. As she picked up the napkin to return it to him, her eyes scanned the scribbles. Her breath caught. It wasn't just math. It was a propulsion dynamics equation, and a deeply flawed one. It was related to the Croft conundrum, a famously unsolved problem in aerospace engineering concerning single-stage-to-orbit engines. An elegant, almost impossible challenge she had obsessed over in her Caltech days. Without thinking, she grabbed a pen from her apron. On a fresh napkin, she wrote a short, elegant string of code and a single corrective formula, a solution so simple and brilliant it had been overlooked by everyone. It was a key she had worked out one sleepless night long ago. After the commotion died down, the man in the corner booth got up to leave. He'd seen the whole exchange. As he passed Elena, he made eye contact. He was about to pay at the counter when she acted on pure impulse. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet. He turned. She held out the folded napkin, "I think you might find this interesting." He took it, unfolded it, and his eyes scanned the equation. His expression shifted. Confusion turned to shock. The color drained from his face. He stood utterly still, staring at the formula, paralyzed. He looked back at her, his analytical gaze now a maelstrom of disbelief and awe. He didn't say a word. He just dropped a crisp $100 bill on the counter for his $3 soda, turned and walked out, clutching the note that held the key to his empire. The engine of the Ford F-150 wasn't running. The sounds of the Austin street, the distant wail of a siren, the rhythmic thumping of bass from a passing car, the chatter of pedestrians were a distant, muffled hum outside the thick glass of the driver's side window. Inside the cab, the only sound was the frantic, powerful beating of Julian Croft's own heart. He wasn't paralyzed by confusion. He was paralyzed by the blinding, world-altering force of pure clarity. The napkin felt absurdly flimsy in his hand, a cheap piece of paper bearing the faint, greasy scent of tacos. Yet the ink on its surface represented the most elegant and profound piece of engineering he had seen in a decade. It was more than a corrective formula. It was a paradigm shift, an answer to a question that had cost Orion Dynamics nearly 2 years. $250 million in failed simulations and prototypes, and was slowly bleeding the morale of his 800-person R&D division dry. Project Daedalus. It was his magnum opus, the gamble on which he had staked the future of his company, a single stage-to-orbit engine using a revolutionary propellant cycle that would, if it worked, make a trip to low Earth orbit as routine as a transatlantic flight. It was the key to unlocking the solar system, and for 18 agonizing months, it had been a spectacular, catastrophic failure. The engine tore itself apart at 90% thrust every single time. His teams of world-class engineers, the best minds money could buy, had thrown everything at it: exotic materials, quantum computing simulations, AI-driven designs. They had produced nothing but increasingly complex and expensive ways to fail. And the answer, the simple, devastatingly clever answer, was scribbled on a napkin by a waitress with tired eyes. His hand, steady from years of forcing his will upon the world, trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. He didn't scroll through contacts. He tapped a single encrypted icon on his home screen. It rang once before a calm, disembodied voice answered. "Yes, Julian. A Ghost Protocol, Priority 1. He was Julian's head of security, but his role was far more amorphous. He was a fixer, an information gatherer, a ghost himself who moved silently through the digital and physical world. Austin, Texas, a taqueria called El Fuego Lento. There's a waitress. Her name is Elena." He paused, replaying the brief interaction in his mind. The name on her tag. Elena Ramirez. I want to know everything. I want her birth certificate, her kindergarten report card, her SAT scores, every academic paper she ever wrote. I want to know what she dreamed about when she was 10 and why she stopped. I want to know the names of her enemies and the balance of her father's medical debt. I want a complete ghost profile of her life. You have 90 minutes. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a builder. He had started Orion Dynamics in a dusty garage in West Texas with nothing but a welder, a borrowed supercomputer, and an obsessive belief that humanity's future lay beyond the sky. He had fought investors, regulators, and the laws of physics themselves to get where he was. He knew intimately the look of wasted potential. He saw it in the mirror every morning for the first 20 years of his life. A brilliant mind trapped in a dead-end town with no prospects. Someone had taken a chance on him once, a professor who saw past the grease on his hands. That chance had changed his world. The tablet on the passenger seat chimed softly. 67 minutes had passed. He picked it up, the screen glowing to life with the Orion Dynamics logo, before shifting to a secure, encrypted file. Subject: Ramirez Elena. He scrolled. The data streamed past, a life distilled into cold, hard facts. Born in El Paso, public school genius, a string of perfect GPAs, first place in national science fairs, a full scholarship to the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. Her focus: aeronautical and astronautical engineering. Her professor's notes, which Elias had somehow unearthed, were glowing. Her generational mind, uncanny intuitive grasp of complex systems. Her theoretical work on propellant dynamics is already at a postdoctoral level. The reason? Family emergency. Her mother had passed away years earlier. Elena was his only child. The family business, already struggling, collapsed under the weight of his medical care. The debt was astronomical, a crushing figure that made Julian's jaw tighten. Elena had come home, taken the first job she could find, and had been treading water ever since. Her brilliance focused not on the stars, but on making rent and paying for the nurses at her father's long-term care facility. Julian swiped through photos. A smiling young woman in a Caltech sweatshirt, arm in arm with friends on a sun-drenched campus. A more recent candid shot of her leaving the taqueria, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went far beyond a long shift. He saw the ghost of the life she'd lost. He didn't just see a mirror of his past, he felt the burning injustice of it. Genius was the most valuable and fragile resource in the universe. To see it squandered, serving lukewarm salsa to ungrateful tech bros, felt like a crime against the future. He knew then that a simple job offer would be an insult. It would be an act of charity, a rich man bestowing a favor. A mind like hers, a spirit that had endured that kind of pressure, wouldn't respond to charity. She would resent it. She needed to be challenged, tested. He had to know if the fire he saw in her academic record was still there, buried under the ash of her circumstances. He needed to know if she had the grit to match her intellect. He tapped the encrypted icon again. Elias, I need a car at her address tomorrow at 10 a.m. sharp. A chartered Gulfstream G650, Austin to the facility airstrip. Unmarked. You'll handle the logistic. I want it on a business card and an envelope. The materials need to be unusual, memorable. Have them delivered to her apartment tonight. No contact. Julian paused, formulating the words. This had to be perfect. Not a request, but a challenge. Not an offer, but a dare. He was extending a key. He needed to see if she still had the courage to turn a lock into a door she couldn't see. The message, Julian said, his voice firm with purpose, will read, Miss Ramirez, genius should never be wasted on serving mediocrity. Your equation is a key. I have the lock. A car will be at your address tomorrow at 10 a.m. This isn't a job offer. It's an invitation to finish what you started. Each step sent a dull ache from the soles of her worn-out sneakers up through her legs and into the small of her back. The Austin air, thick with the post-dusk humidity of late summer, did little to wash away the taqueria's lingering scent of grease and grilled onions that clung to her like a second skin. Her shift had been a grueling 10 hours, a marathon of refilling salsa bowls, placating impatient customers, and mopping up spilled horchata. The strange, silent man and his paralyzing reaction to her note felt less like a real event and more like a brief, vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion. Reality was the cracked pavement under her feet and the weight of the day pressing down on her. She trudged up the 3 flights of stairs to the apartment she shared with Sophia, her keys already in hand. The door opened into the comforting chaos of their shared life. A stack of Sophia's legal textbooks on the floor, a half-finished mug of coffee on the counter, and the low hum of a true crime documentary playing on the television. You look like you wrestled a garbage disposal and lost, Sophia said, without looking up from the couch. Her feet tucked under her as she scrolled through her phone. Close, Elena mumbled, dropping her bag by the door. It was a 12-top of finance bros who wanted to split the check 11 ways and thought a 5% tip was generous. Protruding from under the apartment door, a stark black rectangle against the scuffed wood. It was an envelope, but unlike any she had ever seen. It was too sharp, too perfect. Her first thought was that it was a high-end eviction notice. "What's this?" she asked, bending down to pick it up. The envelope was cool to the touch and surprisingly heavy. The paper, if it was paper, had a smooth, matte finish that seemed to absorb the light, with a strange, almost metallic rigidity. There was no stamp, no address, and no name. Just a small silver symbol embossed in the center where the wax seal on an ancient letter might be. It was a stylized constellation, a graceful arc of stars she vaguely recognized but couldn't immediately place. "Whoa! What is that?" Sophia was off the couch now, her curiosity piqued. She took the envelope from Elena, turning it over in her hands. "This feels expensive and creepy. Very, very creepy. Is it from that guy you were talking about? The quiet one." He didn't say anything. Her fingers trembled slightly. Inside, nestled against a velvety black lining, were 2 items. The first was a business card. It was made of the same heavy black material, the silver constellation gleaming at the top. Below it, 2 lines of minimalist text were printed in the same silver: Julian Croft, CEO, Orion Dynamics. The name hit her with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, violent collision of her past and present. Julian Croft wasn't just a CEO. In the world she had been forced to abandon, he was a titan, a living legend, the reclusive genius who had revolutionized the aerospace industry, whose work was required reading in every engineering program in the country. Orion Dynamics was the dream, the place you went after Caltech or MIT if you were one of the chosen few. And he had been the quiet man in the corner booth, dressed in a faded t-shirt, watching her serve tacos. "Orion Dynamics," Sophia breathed, peering over her shoulder. "As in the space travel company? The guy who's richer than God? Elena, what is going on?" Her mind was reeling, trying to connect the dots between the world's most famous engineer and a greasy spoon taqueria. She numbly reached back into the envelope. The second item made her heart stop altogether. It was a reservation confirmation, printed on the same impossibly high-quality stock. At the top was the Orion Dynamics logo. It confirmed a single passenger seat on a private Gulfstream jet, scheduled to depart from Austin Executive Airport the next day. At noon, the destination was listed only as a set of geographic coordinates that her mind, still wired for navigation and physics, instantly recognized as being in the middle of the New Mexico desert. The passenger's name, Elena Ramirez. Tucked into the fold of the reservation was a small, handwritten note. The script was sharp and decisive, penned in shimmering silver ink. "Miss Ramirez, your equation is a key. I have the lock. A car will be at your address tomorrow at 10 a.m. This isn't a job offer. It's an invitation to finish what you started." Elena read the note once, then twice, the words seeming to hum with a strange energy. He knew her name, he knew her address. The analytical gaze she'd felt on her in the diner suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. He hadn't just been watching, he had been evaluating. "No!" Sophia's voice was sharp, pulling Eleanor from her trance. She snatched the papers from Eleanor's hand, her eyes wide with alarm. "Absolutely not. This is insane. He had you investigated, Elena. That's how he knows your name, where you live. This isn't an invitation. It's a summons from some creepy billionaire who gets whatever he wants. A private jet to the middle of the desert? This screams human trafficking. I'm not letting you go. He's not some random criminal. He saw a smart, pretty, broke girl, and now he wants to play some kind of sick game. You cannot be seriously considering this." She looked at the note again. An invitation to finish what you started. The words resonated in a place deep inside her that she had sealed off 3 years ago. The part of her that still dreamed of thrust-to-weight ratios and the elegant dance of orbital mechanics. This wasn't a creepy pickup line, it was a lifeline. It was a recognition of the person she used to be, the person she was terrified she had lost forever. She looked around the cramped apartment, at the peeling paint and the stack of bills on the counter. Among them, another reminder from her father's care facility. This was her life, safe, predictable, and suffocating. The choice before her was a sheer cliff face. On one side was the familiar, grinding certainty of her current existence. On the other was a terrifying, unknown abyss that might lead to a fall, or it might let her fly. He saw the equation, Elena said, her voice finding a sliver of strength. He understood what it meant. This isn't about me, Sophia. Not the waitress part. This is about the part of me that wrote it. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time in years, it was accompanied by something else. A wild, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating flicker of hope. The silence in the apartment was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, broken only by the frantic, rhythmic tapping of Sophia's fingers on her laptop keyboard and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The contents of the black envelope lay on their scuffed coffee table like artifacts from a crashed UFO, alien, incomprehensible, and radiating a strange power. The business card, the jet reservation, the note. They felt less like paper and more like promises or threats. Elena sat on the edge of the lumpy couch, staring at them. Her mind, usually a seamless processor of logic and order, was a maelstrom of conflicting variables. The waitress, who had just clocked out of a 10-hour shift, was screaming that this was insane. But the engineer, the ghost of the girl from Caltech, was leaning forward, captivated. "Okay, I've got nothing," Sophia said finally, pushing the laptop away with a frustrated sigh. She ran a hand through her dark hair, her face etched with worry. Julian Croft is a digital phantom. There are thousands of articles about Orion Dynamics, financial reports, launch announcements, government contracts, but almost nothing personal about him. No tabloid fodder, no scandals, no public appearances outside of a Senate hearing on space exploration 5 years ago. He's either a saint or he has the best security and PR team on the planet. And saints don't have people's home addresses delivered to them on a silver platter 67 minutes after meeting them. Best case scenario. This is some bizarre, eccentric recruitment process. He wants to hire you. But why the mystery? Why the private jet to nowhere? Companies send offer letters, not cryptic summonses. It's a power play. He's trying to destabilize you. See how you react when you're completely out of your element. Elena, I'm a paralegal. I read depositions about what powerful, untouchable men do when they think no one is looking. This has every red flag: isolation, secrecy, an extreme power imbalance. You'd be completely at his mercy out there. The way he had found her was deeply unsettling. The nature of the invitation was unorthodox to the point of being reckless. And yet, the note. She picked it up again, the sharp silver script seeming to catch the dim light of the lamp. Genius should never be wasted on serving mediocrity. He hadn't commented on her appearance. He hadn't tried to flatter her. He had spoken directly to the most wounded and vital part of her soul. He had seen her, the real her, the one she kept locked away, the one who could solve the Croft conundrum on a napkin. For 3 years, she had felt invisible. Her professors had forgotten her, her former classmates had moved on to brilliant careers, and her customers saw right through her. But this man, this ghost, had seen her in a way no one else had. But what if it's real, Sophie? Elena's voice was barely a whisper. What if it's exactly what he says it is? An invitation, a chance. The screen lit up with a familiar name, Northwood Skilled Nursing. Her stomach plummeted. It was the 3rd time they had called this month. She knew what it was about. Her father's account was past due. Again. The cost of his care was a relentless, rising tide, and she was drowning. She silenced the call, but the damage was done. The brief, intoxicating fantasy of the invitation crashed into the brutal reality of her life. She looked around the apartment. The second-hand furniture, the stack of bills held down by a cheap souvenir, the faint scent of mildew from the bathroom they could never seem to fix. This was her prison, a prison built of love and duty, but a prison nonetheless. Sophia's logic was sound, her warnings born of fierce affection, but her logic couldn't pay the bills. Her logic couldn't turn back the clock and put Elena back in a Caltech classroom. Her logic offered safety, but it was the safety of a cage. Julian Croft's offer was a key. It might be to a different cage, a more dangerous one, or it might be to the open sky. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked at her friend, whose face was a mask of fear and love. "I have to go, Sophia." Sophia stared at her, her expression crumbling from anger to disbelief, and finally to a heartbreaking resignation. "Elena, don't, please. I keep deferring my student loans until they swallow me whole. I watch my father get substandard care because I can't afford the best for him. This is a slow death, Sophie. You know it is. She gestured to the impossible ticket on the table. "This might be a fast one, but it might be a life. I have to take that chance. I have to know if the person who wrote that equation is still in here somewhere. If she couldn't stop her, she would arm her. The next few hours were a whirlwind of frantic preparation. Sophia, ever the pragmatist, went into crisis mode. She made Elena write down every detail, the tail number of the jet if she could see it, the exact coordinates, Julian Croft's name. She took photos of the envelope and its contents. "I'm turning on location sharing on your phone, and you are not to turn it off. Do you hear me?" Sophia commanded, her fingers flying across Elena's phone screen. "You will check in with me every hour on the hour. If I miss 2 check-ins, I'm calling the Texas Rangers, the FBI, and the Austin American Statesman. I swear to God, Elena, I will make this man so famous he won't be able to buy a cup of coffee in peace." What did you pack for a potential new life or a potential kidnapping? Her entire wardrobe consisted of faded jeans, a few t-shirts, and a single, simple black dress she'd bought for a scholarship dinner years ago. She folded it carefully and placed it on top, a silent prayer to a future that might require it. They didn't sleep. They sat in the pre-dawn darkness, nursing cups of coffee, the true crime documentary long since forgotten. They talked about their childhoods, about their silly high school dreams, about everything and nothing. They were saying goodbye, just in case. As the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, a fragile truce had settled between them. Sophia's fear was Sophia's fear was still there, a palpable presence in the room, but it was now wrapped in a blanket of fierce, unwavering support. Elena stood by the window, clutching her bag, watching the world wake up. The fear in her stomach was a cold, hard knot. But tangled up with it was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a dizzying, terrifying, exhilarating surge of adrenaline. She was no longer a passive victim of her circumstances. She was making a choice. She was calculating the risk. She was taking the leap. She was betting the rest of her life on a single equation scribbled on a napkin. At precisely 10:02 a.m., a hush seemed to fall over the noisy street outside their apartment building. It wasn't a true silence, but a subtle shift in the city's rhythm, as if it were holding its breath. And then it appeared. A black SUV, so dark it seemed to drink the morning light, glided to a stop at the curb. It wasn't a flashy, ostentatious vehicle, but something more serious and intimidating, with tinted windows that betrayed nothing of the interior. It had the quiet, unnerving presence of a government car. Elena, who had been watching from the window, felt her heart leap into her throat. This was it, the point of no return. Sophia was beside her in an instant, grabbing her arm. Her face was pale. "You can still say no, Elena. We can go out the back. We can call the police and say you're being harassed. It's not too late." She could feel the frantic beating of Sophia's heart against her own. "If I don't come back," Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "use everything you have. Make him famous." He was impassive and professional, his eyes scanning the building number before resting on the window where they stood. He didn't wave or beckon. He simply waited, a silent, patient statue. With one last deep breath, Elena grabbed her worn duffel bag. "Check in every hour," Sophia reminded her, her voice trembling. "Every hour," Elena promised. She gave Sophia's hand one final squeeze and walked out the door, leaving her friend, her entire world, the only life she had known for 3 years, behind. The walk down the stairs and across the sidewalk felt 100 miles long. The driver watched her approach without expression. He didn't ask for her name. As she reached the vehicle, he simply said, "Miss Ramirez," his tone neutral and professional. He opened the rear door for her, and she slid inside. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thump, sealing her in, and the sounds of the city vanished completely. The interior of the SUV was a cocoon of cool, silent luxury. The seats were soft black leather, and there was no clutter, no personal effects, just an overwhelming sense of sterile efficiency. The tinted windows transformed the familiar streets of East Austin into a muted, distant film. She watched her apartment building, with Sophia, a tiny, frantic figure on the steps, recede and then disappear around a corner. She was unmoored, a satellite cast loose from its orbit. The ride to the airport was conducted in absolute silence. The driver never spoke, never looked at her in the rearview mirror. Elena watched the city she knew so well blur past. The vibrant murals, the funky coffee shops, the gleaming tech campuses that had once represented her future. It was a city of ghosts, and she was now one of them, haunting her own past from behind bulletproof glass. They bypassed the main terminals of Austin Bergstrom International Airport, heading instead for the discreet private world of the executive hangars. The SUV pulled directly onto the tarmac, stopping a few yards from a jet that stole Elena's breath. It was a Gulfstream, she knew from its distinctive profile, but it looked like no Gulfstream she had ever seen in her textbooks. It was painted a sleek, matte black, a finish that seemed to absorb the harsh Texas sunlight. There were no registration numbers visible on the fuselage, only the single, elegant silver constellation on the tail fin, the same one from the envelope. It wasn't just an airplane, it was a statement. A piece of the future that had somehow landed in the present. The driver opened her door. "They're ready for you, Miss Ramirez." "Welcome aboard, Miss Ramirez. Mr. Croft has arranged everything for your comfort. May I take your bag?" She ascended the stairs and stepped inside. The cabin was a marvel of minimalist design and high technology. Polished dark wood, cream leather seats, and subtle silver accents that echoed the Orion logo. There were no garish displays of wealth. Everything was understated, elegant, and engineered for purpose. It felt less like a private jet and more like the command deck of a starship, and she was the only passenger. She sank into one of the plush leather seats, her fingers tracing the perfect stitching. The flight attendant offered her a drink, and moments later, the jet began to move. As it taxied down the runway, Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. This was real. This was happening. The engines spooled up with a deep, powerful roar, and the plane surged forward with incredible force, pressing her back into her seat. Within moments, they were airborne, climbing steeply into the clouds. Below her, Austin shrank away. The taqueria, her apartment, the nursing home, all the landmarks of her constrained life, vanishing into a green and brown haze. She was untethered, suspended between the world she knew and a future that was a complete and terrifying unknown. The flight was smooth and silent. The attendant served her lunch on a simple, elegant tray: grilled salmon with asparagus, a small, perfect salad, and a glass of water so cold and clear it tasted like a revelation. It was a better meal than any she had ever eaten, let alone served. She ate slowly, trying to process the profound, dizzying shift in her reality. She half expected to wake up to the sound of her alarm clock, the smell of burnt chili in the air. But 2 hours later, the dream continued. The jet began its descent. Elena looked out the window and saw not the familiar patchwork of central Texas, but a vast, breathtaking expanse of ochre, rust, and deep red. The New Mexico desert stretched to the horizon, a stark and beautiful landscape under a brilliant blue sky. And then she saw it. At first it was just a shimmer on the horizon, a heat haze mirage. But as they grew closer, it resolved into a sprawling complex of low-slung, white buildings and geodesic domes that gleamed like polished bone in the sun. It was utterly isolated. A futuristic city set down in the middle of an ancient landscape, the legendary Orion Dynamics Skunk Works. The jet landed with barely a bump on a black runway that seemed to have been carved directly from the desert floor. As it taxied toward the main hangar, the cabin door opened, and a wave of dry, clean desert heat washed over her. The flight attendant smiled. "We've arrived, Miss Ramirez. Welcome." The silence of the desert was immense, a stark contrast to the constant hum of the city. And there, waiting for her at the bottom of the steps, was Julian Croft. The disguise was gone. The faded band t-shirt and scuffed boots were replaced by dark, practical trousers and a simple grey flight jacket zipped over a black polo shirt. The clothes were understated, but the fit was perfect. The quality unmistakable. He was younger than she had thought, maybe in his mid-30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His quiet intensity, which had felt out of place in the taqueria, now felt perfectly at home. Here, in his element, It was transformed into an aura of absolute command. He watched her descend the final step, his expression unreadable, but focused entirely on her. "Miss Ramirez," he said, his voice a calm, low baritone that carried easily in the still desert air. "Welcome to Orion. I trust your flight was comfortable. Mr. Croft, all your questions will be answered. But first, there's something I need you to see." He turned and gestured toward the massive, silent hangar. "This is where we build the future, and right now the future is broken." He turned and began to walk toward a door set into the side of the massive main hangar, a portal that seemed impossibly small against the structure's immense scale. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would be. Eleanor, clutching the strap of her duffel bag, hurried to keep pace, her worn sneakers crunching softly on the black tarmac. The transition was breathtaking. One moment she was in the vast, searing brightness of the open desert. The next, she was enveloped in the cool, echoing twilight of the hangar. The sheer scale of the interior space was difficult for her mind to process. The ceiling was 100 feet above her, a web of steel girders and catwalks. The air smelled of ozone, sterilized metal, and a faint, clean scent of liquid oxygen. It was the scent of her dreams. This wasn't a factory. It was a cathedral. Instead of stained glass, there were massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows looking out onto the desert. Instead of pews, there were gleaming workstations and diagnostic arrays. And instead of idols, there were gods of metal, massive, partially assembled rocket components held in enormous gyroscopic cradles. A team of engineers, dwarfed by their creations, moved with the quiet, focused reverence of acolytes. Elena's heart, which had been pounding with fear, now pounded with something else, a deep, aching sense of homecoming. "All new employees require level 5 clearance before entering the R&D labs," Julian said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He led her toward a sleek, featureless wall. "We'll have to expedite your onboarding." For a moment, she was an engineering student again, her mind instinctively deconstructing the system: retinal scanner, biometric heat signature, gate analysis. It was a security system so advanced it was practically theoretical. "It reads the unique bioelectric signature of a person's nervous system," Julian stated, noticing her analytical gaze. "Impossible to replicate." He stepped through the shimmering barrier, and after a moment's hesitation, Elena followed, a faint tingle passing over her skin. They moved through a series of corridors that felt more like art installations than hallways, the walls shifting from opaque to transparent, revealing clean rooms, control centers, and labs where scientists worked on projects that looked like they were pulled from science fiction. The entire facility hummed with a quiet, powerful energy, the collective force of 1,000 brilliant minds focused on a single purpose. Finally, Julian led her into a glass-walled conference room that jutted out over the main assembly floor, offering a panoramic view of the entire operation. In the center of the floor below, suspended in a massive gimbal, was a rocket engine. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Eleanor had ever seen. A complex sculpture of pipes, turbines, and nozzles, it gleamed under the powerful overhead lights, looking both impossibly powerful and exquisitely fragile. "This," Julian said, his voice low and serious, "is Project Daedalus." It was the schematic from the napkin, but now rendered in perfect, terrifying detail. The goal of Daedalus is simple and audacious: to create a fully reusable, single-stage-to-orbit engine that can make space travel 100 times cheaper. No more disposable rockets, no more billion-dollar price tags per launch. It's the key to everything: colonizing the moon, mining asteroids, going to Mars. It's the future of this company, and I believe the future of humanity. We're using a full-flow staged combustion cycle with densified methalox propellant. The power output is immense, but it creates a harmonic resonance at high thrust that the engine structure cannot withstand, or I should say could not withstand. The simulation ran again. This time, as the thrust indicator climbed past 90%, a series of dampening fields and micro-adjustments in the propellant flow stabilized the engine. The violent, destructive shaking vanished. The simulation held steady at 100% thrust, the engine glowing with controlled, immense power. Elena stared, speechless. Seeing her scrawled theory from a cheap napkin flawlessly integrated into a multi-billion-dollar simulation was the most profound validation she had ever felt. It was real, it worked. "Your equation," Julian said, turning to her, his eyes locking onto hers. It was the key. It created a feedback loop that anticipates and neutralizes the resonance before it can build. "It's brilliant, it's the reason you're here. It stabilized the primary system," Julian continued, his tone shifting. "But in doing so, it revealed a deeper, more critical problem. A secondary flaw we never even saw, because we could never run the engine at full power long enough to find it." He highlighted a specific component, the thermal exhaust manifold, the crucial piece of engineering that was meant to cool the engine bell. "Your solution works," Julian said, his voice grim. "It saves the combustion chamber, but all that resonant energy has to go somewhere. Your equation diverts it, but the manifold can't handle the redirected thermal load. At 92% thrust, it begins to sublimate. The alloy literally turns from a solid into a gas. It's not an explosion, it's a disintegration. We've run 1,000 material science simulations. We've tried every composite, every ceramic, every cryo-cooling design imaginable. Nothing works. My entire team of PhDs, the best engineers from Stanford, MIT, and Cambridge, has concluded that it's an impossible material science and engineering challenge within the known laws of physics." The beautiful machine now looked like a bomb waiting to go off. He turned to face her fully, the weight of his 2-year multi-billion-dollar failure palpable in the air between them. "They say it's impossible. They've given me a dozen reasons why we need to abandon the project and start over. But they are looking at the problem from the inside, trapped by their own assumptions. I believe in finding the right mind, a different perspective. A mind that isn't bound by a billion-dollar R&D budget, but knows how to solve problems with whatever is at hand. A mind that saw the answer to a riddle that stumped the entire aerospace industry on a greasy napkin in a taqueria. My team of experts says it can't be done. I'm hoping they're wrong." He had laid out an impossible problem, a riddle that had broken the best minds in her field, and then looked at her, a waitress in worn-out jeans, as if she held the answer. Before she could formulate a response, before she could even process the sheer audacity of his faith in her, he turned from the overlook. "Come," he said simply. "It's time you met the team." The air grew colder, the ambient hum of the facility fading into a profound, almost clinical silence. With each step, Eleanor felt as though she were moving deeper into the brain of the operation, away from the brawn and into the central nervous system where the real thinking and fighting happened. Julian stopped before a heavy, soundproof door and pressed his thumb to a scanner. It hissed open. The room inside was a stark contrast to the awe-inspiring hangar. It was an intellectual gladiator pit. A large, circular table made of a single piece of polished black composite dominated the space. The walls were floor-to-ceiling data screens, currently displaying cascading lines of telemetry and complex structural analyses in cool blue and white light. Seated around the table were 5 people who collectively represented the pinnacle of modern aerospace engineering. They didn't look up immediately. Their focus was absolute. But Elena felt their awareness of her presence as a physical force, a sudden drop in barometric pressure. At the head of the table, her back straight, sat a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled into a severe, immaculate bun. Her face was sharp and intelligent, her expression one of permanent, impatient analysis. This, Eleanor knew instinctively, was the Alpha. Julian's voice cut through the silence. "Everyone, this is Elena Ramirez." And she was a Caltech dropout who smelled faintly of grilled onions. "Miss Ramirez will be consulting with us on the Daedalus manifold issue," Julian stated, his tone deliberately neutral. He didn't offer any further explanation, simply tossed the grenade into the middle of the table. and waited for it to detonate. The woman at the head of the table was the first to react. She slowly placed her stylus down, the soft click echoing in the silent room. Her piercing grey eyes swept over Elena, from her cheap sneakers to her faded t-shirt, in a clinical, dismissive appraisal that lasted no more than 2 seconds, but felt like a full-body scan. "This is her." The woman's voice was crisp, precise, and laced with a cold, undisguised layer of disbelief. She didn't look at Elena as she spoke. She addressed Julian directly, as if Elena were a specimen under glass. "The waitress." Julian remained impassive. "Elena, this is Dr. Eris Thorne, the director of Project Daedalus." It was the look of a predator examining a creature that had inexplicably wandered into its territory. "With all due respect, Julian," Thorne said, her voice dangerously calm, "this project is in a critical phase. We are facing a materials science barrier that is testing the limits of known physics. My team is comprised of the foremost experts in thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and exotic material. What precisely do you believe a former undergraduate student can possibly offer that my entire department has missed?" Thorne was systematically dismantling Elena's credibility before she had even spoken a word. Elena's own mind screamed at her. "Imposter, you don't belong here. Run!" Her hands felt clammy and her throat was tight. She could feel the other engineers watching, waiting for her to crumble. She could list her academic achievements, but they would pale in comparison. She could talk about her passion, but they would dismiss it as sentimentality. They spoke the language of data, of proof, of peer-reviewed certainty. She had none of that, so she wouldn't try to speak their language. She would speak her own. She took a deep breath, forcing her gaze to meet Dr. Thorne's without flinching. "You're trying to cool the manifold," Elena said, her voice quieter than she intended, but steady. Thorne raised a single skeptical eyebrow. "An astute observation. You've tried to solve it by creating more resilient materials or more efficient cooling systems to dissipate the heat." A stunned silence fell over the room. The arrogant young engineer's smirk vanished. Dr. Thorne's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing into slits. "The problem isn't how to dissipate the heat," Elena elaborated, the idea taking shape in her mind even as she spoke the words. "The problem is why so much excess thermal energy is being funneled into the manifold in the first place. My equation solves the harmonic resonance in the primary combustion chamber, yes, but it's a brute force solution. It doesn't eliminate the energy, it just redirects it. You're all trying to build a better dam to hold back the flood, but you should be asking if there's a way to divert the river upstream. Have you looked at the propellant injectors, the turbopump sequencing? You're fighting a symptom, a very violent and expensive symptom, but you haven't found the disease." She had not presented a single new piece of data. She had not offered a solution. She had simply reframed the problem with a question so fundamental, so contrary to their months of focused effort, that it had momentarily short-circuited their collective genius. She had implied that they, the best in the world, had been looking in the wrong place for almost 2 years. Dr. Thorne stared at her, her face an unreadable mask of stone. The initial dismissive contempt in her eyes was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a flicker of cold, sharp, analytical fury. Elena had not won her over. She had just declared war. Julian Croft, who had remained a silent observer throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, a faint glint of something like triumph in his eyes. "It seems we have a difference in diagnostic opinion," he said, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "And there's only one way to settle it." It was thick with the indignation of Dr. Thorne and her team, their collective pride wounded by the waitress who had dared to question their fundamental approach. Elena stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, feeling as though she had just kicked a hornet's nest the size of a planet. She had thrown down a gauntlet she wasn't sure she could defend, and now the entire room was waiting for her to be torn apart. It was Julian Croft who broke the spell. He had remained a neutral observer, a king watching the preliminary skirmishes from his throne, his face betraying nothing. Now, he leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the polished black table. "It seems we have a difference in diagnostic opinion," he said, his calm voice slicing through the tension. His gaze swept across the stony faces of his leadership team before finally landing on Eleanor. Dr. Thorne and her team have 18 months of data and 5,000 failed simulations to support their conclusion that the manifold is an insurmountable material science problem. Miss Ramirez, you have a hypothesis, an assertion that the root cause lies elsewhere. In science, disagreements like this are not settled by rank or resume. They are settled by proof. Thorne's posture stiffened. Julian, this is absurd. We can't possibly redirect the project's resources to chase down a hunch. We have protocols. We follow the data. The data tells us the manifold is the point of failure. It doesn't necessarily tell you why, Julian countered, his voice still even, but now carrying a sharp, undeniable edge of command. We have spent $250 million building a better dam. Miss Ramirez is suggesting we look at the river. I, for one, am willing to invest a little more time to explore that possibility before we abandon the entire valley. So we are going to conduct an experiment, a test. We'll call it the Crucible. I'm not asking you to consult, Miss Ramirez, he said, his voice dropping slightly. I'm giving you a chance to prove you're who I think you are. For the next 36 hours, you will be given Level 5 clearance and sole command of the primary integration lab. You will have access to every byte of data from Project Daedalus, every simulation, every material spec sheet, every failed prototype's telemetry. The entire Daedalus leadership team, he gestured to the furious engineers at the table, will be on standby as your support staff. They will be required to answer any question and run any simulation you request, without delay or debate. The arrogant young engineer looked as if he'd been slapped. Dr. Thorne's face was a thundercloud of controlled fury. Julian was not just giving Elena a chance, he was temporarily placing her above them. Your task is twofold, Julian continued, his eyes boring into Elena's. First, prove your hypothesis. Find the source of the excess thermal energy you claim exists. Second, design a viable, manufacturable solution. Not a theory, a working schematic that can be prototyped. If at the end of 36 hours you succeed, he declared, his voice resonating with finality, you are no longer a consultant. You will become the new head of the Daedalus Manifold Integration Project. If you fail, or if you find that Dr. Thorne was right all along, a car will take you back to the airstrip. You'll be home in Austin by morning. No questions asked. Thorne, Eris, are the terms clear? She saw this for what it was. A test not just of Elena, but of her own leadership, a public rebuke of her failure to solve the problem. Perfectly, she said, her voice dripping with ice. Then Julian looked at Elena. The entire room, the entire future of the project, the entire trajectory of her life pivoted on her answer. All of Sophia's warnings, all of her own fears, all the voices of doubt screamed in her mind. This was impossible. It was a setup, a cruel, elaborate game. But then she saw the engine in her mind's eye, the beautiful broken god of metal. She heard the echo of her own voice questioning their assumptions. The engineer in her, dormant for so long, was awake now, and she was hungry. I accept, Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. A slow, dangerous smile played on Julian Croft's lips. Excellent. Dr. Thorne, please escort Miss Ramirez to Lab 1 and ensure her team is aware of the protocol. Dr. Thorne moved with a stiff, furious grace, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the polished concrete floor. She did not speak. Elena, walking beside her, felt 1,000 questions bubbling up but knew better than to ask any of them. They arrived at a set of massive blast doors, the kind one would expect to see on a bunker. Thorne pressed her palm to a panel, and the doors hissed open with a rush of cool, filtered air. The space beyond was an engineer's fantasy. It was a vast, circular room with a soaring ceiling, the walls lined with glowing holographic displays and advanced fabrication units. In the center of the room was a suspended interactive holographic projector. It was a temple of technology, and for the next 36 hours, it was her sanctuary and her prison. The system is voice-activated, Thorne said, her tone clipped and devoid of any warmth. "You can access the entire Daedalus database, run simulations on the central server, and interface with any of my engineers by stating their name and your request. They are on call. They will comply. Is there anything else? Very well, your time starts now." The heavy doors began to slide shut behind her, the gap of light narrowing until it was a single, bright sliver. Eleanor caught one last glimpse of Thorne's rigid back before the doors sealed with a deep, resonant boom, plunging the room into a soft, humming silence. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, in the most advanced research lab on the planet. She stood in the center of the room, her worn duffel bag still slung over her shoulder, a ghost from another life. The soft blue light from the holographic displays painted shifting patterns on her face. For a long moment, she did nothing, the sheer, crushing weight of the impossible task threatening to suffocate her. Then she let the bag drop to the floor, the soft thud the only sound in the vast, silent space. She took a deep breath, rolled up her sleeves and walked toward the light. The crucible had begun. The moment the lab doors boomed shut, the silence they left behind was absolute. It was a pressurized, expectant silence, the kind that exists only in places completely cut off from the outside world. For a full minute, Elena stood motionless in the center of the vast, circular room, her duffel bag a pathetic, lumpy anchor to her old life on the sterile, glowing floor. The scale of the technology surrounding her was breathtaking, designed to empower and create, but right now, it felt like the architecture of a very elegant tomb. The weight of the 36-hour clock, which had just begun its silent countdown in the corner of her vision, pressed down on her. Imposter. The word slithered through her mind, cold and sharp. They're all out there, the best in the world, waiting for the waitress to fail. She shook her head, forcing the voice down. This was no time for fear. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She dropped her bag, the sound echoing in the stillness, and walked to the central holographic interface. "System," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising herself. "Activate. Display all telemetry, stress analyses, and material composition data for the last 100 Daedalus manifold failure simulation." It was beautiful, complex, and utterly overwhelming. For the next 8 hours, she lost herself in that galaxy. She followed the digital breadcrumbs left by Dr. Thorne and her team, tracing their every step. Their work was brilliant. They had designed alloys that shouldn't exist, created cooling channels as intricate as a hummingbird's circulatory system, and run simulations of such complexity that it required a dedicated quantum server. And they had failed every single time. As the hours bled away, Elena felt a creeping sense of dread. She was seeing exactly what they had seen. Every avenue she explored, every variable she tweaked, ended at the same impenetrable wall. The thermal load was simply too high. The laws of physics, as they had written them, were absolute. At hour 10, slumped in a minimalist chair that was probably a design masterpiece but felt like a rock, she had to admit the terrifying truth. From the inside, looking at the problem their way, Dr. Thorne was right. It was impossible. Frustration, hot and acidic, burned in her chest. She pushed away from the interface, the galaxy of data collapsing into a single point of light. She began to pace the circumference of the lab, the soft soles of her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. She was playing their game, using their rules, and they had already proven it couldn't be won. She needed another way. Her thoughts, desperate for an escape, drifted away from the cold, sterile perfection of the lab. They drifted back in time, back to a place of comforting chaos, of controlled clutter, of the smell of solder and ozone, and the cheap coffee her father always had brewing. Ramirez and Son Electronics Repair. The and Son had always been a joke between them. She could see it perfectly in her mind's eye. The workbench piled high with the guts of old televisions and radios, the walls lined with bins of salvaged capacitors, resistors, and transformers. Her father, his hands stained with grease and flux, holding a circuit board up to the light like a jeweler examining a rare gem. He wasn't a formally trained engineer. He was a tinkerer, a craftsman, a junkyard philosopher who saw genius in the discarded and overlooked. She remembered being 12 years old, struggling with a school project to build a small motor. She had followed the textbook diagram perfectly, but it wouldn't work. Frustrated to the point of tears, she had shown it to him. He'd looked at her complex, perfectly solid creation, then at the textbook, and had let out a soft chuckle. "Mija," he had said, his voice warm and patient, "the person who wrote this book knows how a motor should work. They don't know how to make a broken one run. The most elegant solution is the one with the fewest moving parts. Complexity is just a fancy way to hide a problem you don't understand. Stop trying to build their motor. Build yours." It was a Ramirez solution. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. "Stop trying to build their motor." She whirled around, her eyes wild with a new, electrifying idea. She'd been trying to build their engine, a more perfect, more complex version of Thorne's design. She had been trying to build a better dam. It was time to look at the river. She strode past the shimmering holographic interface and slapped her hand on the wall. "System! Activate the primary whiteboard. Manual mode. Not the manifold. Not the nozzle." She drew the engine's entire propellant flow system, from the intake pumps to the injectors. She ignored the thermal problem completely and focused on her own hypothesis, the resonant energy. She diagrammed the flow of that destructive energy, tracing its path as it was diverted by her equation. As she sketched, another memory surfaced. This one from a dusty corner of her Caltech education, a guest lecture on Soviet-era aerospace design. The professor had been talking about the engines of the MiG-25 Foxbat, a high-altitude interceptor built in the 1960s to chase down American spy planes. Western engineers had initially marveled at its power, assuming it was built with advanced, lightweight alloys. When they finally got their hands on one, they were shocked to find it was made mostly of heavy stainless steel. It was a brute, but the engine's cooling system was bizarrely clever. Faced with a lack of advanced materials, the Soviet engineers had designed a system that used the super-cold fuel itself as a coolant, running it through a complex web of channels within the engine's skin before it was injected into the combustion chamber. Western designers had dismissed the principle as inefficient and crude. But it was robust, it was simple, it worked. Elena froze, the stylus hovering over the whiteboard. It worked. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, this time not with fear, but with the thrilling, electric pulse of discovery. The pieces began to snap together in her mind, a cascade of connections that lit up her brain like a supernova. Thorne's team was trying to cool the manifold from the outside. The Soviets had cooled their engine from the inside. What if the manifold wasn't a passive component that needed to be protected from the heat? What if it was an active part of the cooling system itself? The idea was so radical, so contrary to every design they had tested, that it felt like heresy. The final hours of her crucible were a blur of focused, ecstatic creation. The timid waitress was gone, replaced by the full force of the Caltech prodigy she had been, now augmented by her father's junkyard ingenuity. She was a whirlwind of activity, her voice ringing out in the silent lab with a newfound authority. System, interface with Dr. Ibrahim in materials. I need the full sublimation point and tensile strength data for the OD-72B composite under cryogenic stress. Model the manifold as a porous membrane. I'm sending you the schematic now. Thorne, I need you and your team to run a full vibrational analysis on the pre-combustion turbopump assembly, cross-referenced with the injector sequencing. I believe you'll find a secondary harmonic frequency that's been masked by the larger resonance. I need the results in 1 hour. She was designing a new manifold, one that combined the Soviet principle of internal fuel cooling with Orion's cutting-edge 3D-printed composites. She designed it with a lattice of microscopic internal channels, turning the solid piece of metal into something more like a metal sponge. The super-cold liquid methane would be forced through this lattice before entering the injectors, actively drawing the catastrophic heat out of the manifold and, as a bonus, preheating the fuel for a more efficient burn. It was simple, it was robust, it was a Ramirez solution. As the 35th hour of her crucible drew to a close, she put the final touch on the holographic model. It rotated slowly in the air in front of her, glowing with a soft blue light. It was her motor, and she knew with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones that it would fly. The 36th hour was ending. A quiet, unobtrusive chime echoed through the lab, the sound signaling the end of her trial. Elena stood before the central holographic projector, her body thrumming with a mixture of profound exhaustion and crystalline, diamond-hard focus. She hadn't slept. A half-eaten protein bar and several cups of brutally strong coffee were the only fuel she'd had. Her eyes were gritty, her muscles ached from pacing and standing, but her mind was a blade, honed to its finest edge by the intense, sustained pressure. The imposter was gone. The waitress was a ghost. The engineer was all that remained. She took one last look at the holographic model of her new manifold, rotating slowly in the air. It was a beautiful, elegant thing, a fusion of her father's pragmatism and her own theoretical brilliance. It was the truth. And now she had to defend it. "System," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "Summon Mr. Croft and the Daedalus leadership team to the main conference room. The presentation will begin in 15 minutes. She walked to her duffel bag, pulled out the simple black dress she had packed, a relic from a forgotten scholarship dinner, and changed quickly. It was a symbolic act, a shedding of her old skin. She was done being the waitress in the faded t-shirt. Today, she was meeting them on her own terms. The walk from the lab to the conference room was through the same sterile corridors, but the journey felt entirely different. She wasn't a terrified visitor being led to a meeting. She was a scientist, walking to a peer review. Her footsteps were steady, her gaze fixed straight ahead. When the doors to the conference room hissed open, they were all there, arranged around the black composite table exactly as before. Dr. Thorne and her 4 subordinates sat like a panel of judges, their arms crossed, their faces impenetrable masks of professional skepticism. They were a firing squad waiting for the condemned. Julian Croft stood alone near the glass overlook, his back to the room, watching the silent, gleaming engine below. He didn't turn as she entered. The tension in the room was a physical force. Elena walked to the head of the table, the spot opposite Dr. Thorne. She placed a small data chip on the table and looked at the assembled team. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice even. "As you know, for the last day and a half, I've been reviewing your research on the manifold failure. I want to begin by saying that your work is extraordinary. The materials you've developed, the simulations you've run, it's some of the most brilliant engineering I've ever seen. For the first 10 hours of my analysis," she continued, "I was forced to agree with your conclusion. The problem, as it was defined, was impossible to solve. The thermal load is simply too great for any known or theoretical material to withstand." This was going exactly as she'd predicted. "But then," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength, "I realized we were all asking the wrong question." System display whiteboard file ER9. It was a map of her mind. "You were all trying to build a better dam to contain a catastrophic flood," Elena said, picking up a laser pointer from the table. "And you were right, no dam could hold it. I decided to go look for the river." She pointed to a section of the diagram. "I had a hunch that a secondary high-frequency resonance was being generated upstream of the combustion chamber, a vibration you couldn't see because it was being masked by the larger primary resonance my initial equations solved." "Dr. Thorne, you ran a vibrational analysis for me last night on the turbopump assembly. Could you please display the results?" A new graph appeared on the screen. And there it was, a thin, jagged spike in a previously ignored frequency band. It was the proof of her hypothesis. The disease, that resonance, Eleanor explained, is the source of the excess energy. My equation was a painkiller that stopped the engine from shaking itself apart. but it was just redirecting that energy as focused, intense heat right into the manifold. We weren't fighting a material science problem. We were fighting a harmonics problem. And once you see that, the solution isn't about building a stronger wall. It's about opening a door. This is the answer. She detailed the internal microscopic lattice structure, turning the solid manifold into a porous, hyper-efficient heat exchanger. She showed how the supercold Methalox fuel would now flow through the manifold before being injected, simultaneously cooling the structure far below its sublimation point, while also preheating the fuel for a more complete burn. It doesn't just solve the heat problem, she concluded. It makes the entire engine nearly 2% more efficient. Then, as she had anticipated, the attack began. It's structurally unsound, Thorne snapped, her voice sharp as a scalpel. A porous structure in the engine bell? The vibrational stress alone would tear it to pieces, which is why I had your team run 500 separate stress test simulations on this exact lattice structure. System Display Simulation File ER12. A new set of data flooded the screen, showing the manifold holding perfectly stable under forces exceeding 120% of maximum thrust. The arrogant young engineer scoffed. It's a manufacturing nightmare. Printing a composite with that level of internal complexity is impossible. The technology is experimental, but the simulations show that it would not only be possible, but by printing the manifold as a single contiguous piece, you eliminate over 200 welds, which are the primary points of failure in the current design. She had spent the last hours of her crucible not just refining her design, but anticipating their every objection. And the cruel genius of Julian's test was that she had used them, his own hostile experts, to run the very simulations and gather the very data she now used to dismantle their arguments. Finally, Dr. Aris Thorne, a woman renowned throughout the industry for her intellectual ferocity, ran out of questions. She leaned back in her chair, her face pale, her arms crossed tightly. She stared at the elegant, glowing model of Elena's manifold, then at the irrefutable data on the screen, then at the chaotic, brilliant whiteboard diagram. She had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and proven wrong. The room was utterly silent. Then one of the junior engineers, a young woman in the back, who hadn't spoken the entire time, let out a soft, involuntary breath. "My God!" she whispered to the man next to her, forgetting that her microphone was still on. "It works. It's so simple." Simple. The highest possible praise for an engineer. Elena's gaze drifted from the defeated faces of the team to the man standing by the window. Julian Croft had turned around and was watching her, his face unreadable. He had been the judge, the jury, and the architect of her trial, and now it was time for his verdict. The silence that followed the junior engineer's whispered admission was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was the sound of an entire paradigm shifting, of deeply entrenched certainty being shattered by a simple, undeniable truth. Dr. Aris Thorne stared at the glowing hologram of Elena's manifold, her face a mask of pale, rigid control. She had come expecting to witness the public humiliation of a waitress. Instead, she had been handed a masterclass in engineering that had rendered her own team's 18 months of work obsolete. Julian Croft pushed himself away from the glass overlook, his boots making no sound on the floor. He walked slowly to the head of the table and stood beside Eleanor, though his attention was fixed on his defeated leadership team. "Dr. Thorne," he began, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of finality. "For a year and a half, I have given you and your team every resource, every tool, and every dollar you've asked for. In return, you brought me 5,000 ways this engine can't work and told me it was an immutable law of physics. Not only that, she has identified a fundamental diagnostic error that has cost this project an incalculable amount of time and money." No one breathed. "The crucible is over," Julian declared. "The hypothesis has been proven. You are all dismissed. I want a full diagnostic report on the turbopump resonance on my desk by 800 tomorrow. That is all. He didn't fire them, but he had stripped them of their authority and exposed their failure in the most public way possible. One by one, the engineers rose, their faces a mixture of shame, resentment, and grudging awe. They gathered their tablets in silence and filed out of the room. Doctor Thorne was the last to leave. She paused at the door and her gaze met Elena's. There was no warmth, no concession, only a look of cold, hard, professional animosity that promised this was far from over. Then she was gone, and the door hissed shut, leaving Elena alone with the man who had just cleaved her life in two. The silence that returned was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet sense of equilibrium. Julian walked to a sleek built-in cabinet and retrieved 2 heavy crystal glasses and a bottle of water. He poured 2 glasses and pushed one across the table to her. "Drink," he said. "You look like you're about to fall over." She drank it all in one long, desperate gulp. "I knew you were brilliant, Elena," Julian said, his voice softer now, the hard edge of the CEO replaced by something more personal. He was using her first name. "I saw it on the napkin. What I didn't know was whether you had the courage to defend that brilliance. Thorne and her team are sharks. They're paid to find the weakness in any argument, any design. I had to see if you could survive in the tank." "You didn't just survive," he countered, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "You took the tank apart, piece by piece, with their own tools. What you did in there today wasn't just engineering. It was leadership." The screen glowed to life, displaying a document with the Orion Dynamics logo at the top. It was titled Employment Contract E. "Ramirez, I made you a promise," Julian said. "Orion Dynamics keeps its promises. Position, Head of Integration, Project Daedalus Manifold Subsystem." It was a real title, a position of authority. Base salary. The number that followed had so many zeros it looked like a typo. It was more money than her father had made in his entire life. Signing bonus. A second, equally staggering number designated as payable upon execution of this contract. Special provisions. Orion Dynamics shall, within 24 hours of signing, assume and fully settle all outstanding medical and long-term care debts related to Mr. Hector Ramirez. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. The weight she had been carrying on her shoulders every single second of every single day for 3 years, the crushing, suffocating weight of her father's bills, vanished in an instant. The relief was so total, so profound, it felt like a physical blow. She had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. The contract continued. A full, unconditional scholarship to complete her degree at any university in the world, to be used at her discretion. A housing and relocation package for a luxury condominium in Austin, so she could be near her father. It was a new life, gift-wrapped and presented on a silver platter. It was a fairy tale ending, a winning lottery ticket, a miracle. "This is a blank check, Elena," Julian said softly, seeing the storm of emotions on her face. "It's a chance to have back the life you lost, and then some. It's yours. All you have to do is sign." This was the moment she had been praying for in the darkest hours of the night for 3 straight years. Freedom, security, a future. And as she stared at the digital signature line at the bottom of the screen, a new, unexpected thought began to form in her exhausted mind. It was a quiet, radical, and utterly terrifying idea. She had come here as a waitress, hoping for a lifeline, but the woman who had just survived the crucible, who had faced down a firing squad of geniuses and won, was not the same person who had stepped on that jet yesterday. This was a rescue. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to be rescued anymore. Maybe she wanted to build the boat herself. She looked at Julian Croft, the tears still wet on her cheeks, and opened her mouth to speak, the most audacious words of her life already forming on her tongue. The tablet lay on the polished black table between them, its screen glowing with the promise of a life Elena had never dared to imagine. Every line of the contract was a balm on a wound she had carried for 3 long years. The salary that would end the sleepless nights, the signing bonus that would be a bulwark against any future disaster, and the provision for her father's care, That was the line that had broken her. The sheer, breathtaking relief of it was a physical force that made her want to weep. The waitress in her, the tired, scared 24-year-old who mentally calculated her tips to see if she could afford both groceries and the electric bill, was screaming at her. "Sign it! Sign it now, you fool, before he changes his mind." It was a golden ticket, a royal pardon, an absolution for all her struggles. It was everything she had ever wanted. But as she stared at the glowing screen, another voice, quieter but clearer, began to speak. It was the voice of the engineer who had just spent 36 hours wrestling with an impossible problem and won. The voice of the woman who had faced down a room full of intellectual sharks and hadn't flinched. That voice whispered a dangerous, terrifying question. Is this what you're worth? A salary, a job, a comfortable life as a rewarded employee. Accepting the contract as it was written would make her Julian Croft's most valued and well-compensated asset. But the crucible had changed her. She had not just solved a problem, she had rediscovered herself. And she was beginning to understand that her value wasn't something that could be quantified by a salary, no matter how many zeros it had. She slowly pushed the tablet back across the table toward him. Julian's eyebrows rose in a silent question, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Croft." "Julian," she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "This is the most generous offer I have ever seen. I can't begin to express my gratitude, especially for what you've offered to do for my father. It's everything. But I can't sign it." He said nothing, simply waiting, letting the silence press in on her, testing her resolve. The person who walked into this facility yesterday would have signed this contract without a second thought, Elena said, her voice steady. She would have wept with gratitude and spent the rest of her life feeling indebted to you. And she would have done a very, very good job for you. But she's not the person sitting here now. You tested everything else. You wanted to see if I had the courage to defend my ideas. You wanted to see if I could lead. You wanted to see if I could stand in a room with people who despise me and command their respect through logic alone. You weren't just looking for a new engineer. You were looking for a different kind of partner. He was listening. This contract, she tapped the tablet, makes me an employee. A very, very rich employee, but an employee nonetheless. It's a reward for a task, a rescue package. And I don't want to be rescued anymore. I want to restructure the compensation. The part about my father's care and the education fund, if you would still honor that, it would mean the world to me. But the rest, I want to change it, reduce the base salary significantly. Not to poverty, but to a high-level engineer's salary. Something I earn every week. And the signing bonus, I don't want it. You're turning down millions of dollars. A better way. Instead of the bonus, I want equity. Not a token amount from a stock option pool, and not in the parent company. I want a small but meaningful stake in Project Daedalus itself. Make it a subsidiary, a special project vehicle, whatever you want to call it. Tie my fortunes directly to that engine. Vest my shares on the milestones we both know matter. A successful full-power static test of the new manifold. First, successful orbital launch. First commercial contract. If this engine fails, if my design proves to be a fluke, then I get nothing more than my salary. I will have been paid fairly for my time, but if it flies, I want to fly with it. She had laid all her cards on the table. She had looked a gift horse in the mouth and tried to negotiate the price of its saddle. She had risked everything on this one audacious move. Julian Croft stared at her, and for a long moment he said nothing. He picked up the tablet, swiped the screen off, and set it aside. He looked at her, and his analytical gaze slowly, incredibly, began to melt away, replaced by a look of genuine, unadulterated astonishment, which then morphed into a broad, brilliant smile. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it transformed his entire face, chasing away the shadows of command and revealing something younger, more vibrant, and far more dangerous. He let out a soft, low laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "A week ago, you were serving tacos," he said, his voice filled with a sense of wonder. 48 hours ago, you were terrified to get on my plane, and now you're sitting here, after 36 hours with no sleep, negotiating an equity partnership on a project that defines the entire future of my company. I have negotiated with generals, senators, and the richest people on the planet. And you are the first person who has ever sat across this table and told me you didn't want my money. You wanted a stake. You wanted to share the risk. You have a deal, partner. It wasn't the handshake of a boss hiring an employee. It was the handshake of two builders who had just agreed to construct something impossible together. In that moment, she was no longer a waitress who knew engineering. She wasn't an employee. She wasn't a rescued prodigy. She was a founder. And her real work was just about to begin. The handshake was the end of one war and the beginning of another. The moment their hands parted, the adrenaline that had sustained Elena through 36 hours of intellectual combat and one audacious negotiation drained away, leaving a hollow, buzzing exhaustion in its place. Her body, finally acknowledging the abuse it had endured, began to tremble. Julian saw it instantly. "The deal is done, partner," he said, his voice softening. "The work can wait until tomorrow." He spoke a few quiet words into his watch, and within minutes, a silent man named Elias appeared, the same ghost who had compiled the dossier on her life. He escorted a dazed Elena from the conference room, not to the airstrip, but to a suite in the on-site residences that was larger and more luxurious than any hotel she had ever seen. The suite was a minimalist masterpiece of glass and steel, with a panoramic window that offered a breathtaking, terrifying view of the endless desert. After Elias left, Elena stood in the center of the silent room, her worn duffel bag on the plush, cream-colored carpet, a relic from a life that already felt a lifetime away. The first thing she did was pull out her phone and call Sophia. The conversation was a surreal, emotional blur of tears and disbelief. Elena tried to explain the events of the last 2 days, the impossible problem, the hostile team, the crucible, the counteroffer. Wait, hold on," Sophia had said, her voice crackling with static and shock. "You turned down the money? They offered to pay off your dad's debt and give you millions of dollars, and you said no. I wanted a stake, Sophie. I wanted to be a partner." "Elena," Sophia finally said, her voice filled with a reluctant awe, "you didn't just get a job. You staged a corporate coup." Her old life was over. Her new one began now. Her first day as head of integration, Project Daedalus Manifold Subsystem, started in the same conference room where she had been interrogated. This time, when she walked in, there was a seat for her at the main table, a tablet and a steaming cup of coffee waiting. Dr. Thorne and the other engineers were already there, their faces carefully neutral. The air was thick with a tense professional politeness that was colder and more intimidating than their previous open hostility. Eleanor knew her first move was critical. She had to establish her authority. But she also knew that ruling by decree, using the power Julian had given her, would be a fatal mistake. She had to win them over, not with power, but with competence. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "The first order of business is to begin the prototyping process for the new manifold design. Dr. Chen, Dr. Ibrahim, I'd like you to work together on the composite layering and printing specifications. Dr. Thorne," she turned to the woman at the head of the table, "I'll need you to oversee the integration of the design into the full engine simulation model." "An interesting directive," Dr. Thorne said, her tone perfectly even. "However, our standard protocol for a design change of this magnitude requires a 3-week peer review and a full threat matrix analysis before we allocate resources to prototyping. Of course, as project lead, you can override that." The unspoken challenge was clear. Break the rules, outsider. Show us you don't belong. "Thank you, Dr. Thorne. We'll stick to the protocol," Elena replied smoothly, refusing to take the bait. "Let's start the peer review immediately. Everyone, I want your full, unvarnished critiques of the design on my desk by end of day. Find every flaw. Try to break it." It was a slow, grinding war of attrition, fought in the polite, bloodless language of corporate procedure. They challenged her on everything, burying her in requests for data she didn't have, using obscure acronyms and in-jokes to subtly exclude her, and CCing Julian on emails that questioned her directives. The arrogant young engineer, whose name was Ben, consistently forgot to send her updated simulation results. Thorne, meanwhile, was a master of malicious compliance, doing exactly what Elena asked, but no more, offering no insight, no collaboration, no creative partnership. She was a brick wall of brilliance, waiting for Elena to crash against her. Elena realized that her intellectual victory in the crucible wasn't the end of the test. It was the beginning. The real crucible was this, forging a team out of the very people she had been hired to prove wrong. She changed her tactics. Instead of managing them from the conference room, she went to them. She showed up at their workstations, in their labs, on their turf. She didn't give orders, she asked questions. She found Dr. Chen, a quiet expert in material science, in his lab late one night. Instead of asking for a report, she asked him to explain his research on multi-axis printing. For an hour, she just listened, letting him teach her. She cornered Ben by the coffee machine. Ben, the simulation you ran on the fuel flow resonance was good, but I think you're underestimating the eddy currents in the primary pump. What do you think? She treated him not as a subordinate, but as a colleague whose opinion she valued. He was so taken aback that he forgot to be arrogant and actually started talking about the problem. She worked harder than any of them. She was the first to arrive each morning and the last to leave. She read every research paper, memorized every component schematic, and learned the name of every technician on the assembly floor. She didn't try to be their friend, but she was relentless in her pursuit of being their most competent, dedicated, and unexpectedly humble colleague. The breakthrough, when it came, was small and nearly silent. 3 weeks into her new role, she was working late, staring at the whiteboard in her office, which was now her preferred tool. She was wrestling with a minor but vexing issue in the manifold's lattice structure. She had been staring at it for hours and was completely stuck. The door to her office, which she always left open, darkened. Dr. Iris Thorne stood in the doorway, a tablet in her hand. She was on her way out. She paused, her cold grey eyes taking in the complex equations on the board. Eleanor tensed, expecting a critique, another subtle challenge. "You're calculating the thermal expansion coefficient as a constant," Thorne said, her voice flat. "You're forgetting that the cryogenic fuel will create a non-linear temperature gradient across the composite. The expansion will be asymmetrical." Elena stared at the board. Of course. It was so obvious, a rookie mistake brought on by exhaustion. Thorne had seen it in a 2-second glance. She could have let Elena fail, let her waste a week chasing a flawed design. It would have been a small victory in her war of attrition. But she hadn't. She had, in her own cold, ruthlessly efficient way, helped. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an offer of friendship. But it was the first crack in the ice. Elena picked up her stylus, a slow, tired smile spreading across her face. The engine would be the easy part. Forging this team, winning the respect of Iris Thorne, would be her true masterpiece. And for the first time, she believed it was a problem she could actually solve. The 3 months that followed were the most challenging, exhausting, and exhilarating of Elena's life. The crack in the ice that Dr. Thorne's terse comment had created began to slowly, almost imperceptibly spread. The team's resistance didn't vanish overnight, but it softened, transforming from outright hostility into a grudging professional respect. Elena's relentless work ethic, her genuine curiosity about their individual expertise, and her refusal to pull rank had begun to pay dividends. Ben, the arrogant young simulation specialist, started coming to her with ideas instead of problems. Dr. Chen, the quiet materials expert, began treating her as a true collaborator. They worked with a fierce, unified purpose. The new manifold design, born from a junkyard philosophy, was refined and perfected by the collective genius of the team she was now leading. They built a beautiful, intricate machine, a testament to what they could accomplish together. The atmosphere in the facility shifted from one of tense skepticism to one of cautious, vibrant optimism. They were on the verge of a breakthrough, and for the first time, Eleanor felt like she was truly part of a team. The day of the first full-power static test arrived, cloaked in the cool, clear light of a New Mexico dawn. A nervous electric energy crackled through the control bunker. A concrete and steel observation post buried a safe half-mile from the test stand. Julian Croft was there, standing silently at the back, his presence a powerful amplifier for the already immense pressure. A handful of grim-faced board members, flown in for the occasion, were with him. Elena stood at the main console, a headset connecting her to the test stand crew. She felt 1,000 eyes on her back. Her team was arranged around her, their faces illuminated by the glow of telemetry screens. Dr. Thorne stood beside her, her expression as calm and focused as a surgeon's before the first incision. In the months leading up to this, Thorne had become her reluctant but invaluable second-in-command. Her sharp, critical mind, the perfect whetstone for Elena's more intuitive designs. "All systems are green," Thorne reported, her voice calm in Elena's ear. "Board is green. We are go for ignition sequence on your mark, Elena. The culmination of all their work, the moment of truth." She took a deep breath. "Start the countdown." At 0, a deep, ground-shaking roar rolled across the desert, a physical force that vibrated through the concrete floor of the bunker. On the main screen, the live feed from the test stand showed the Daedalus engine coming to life, bathing the structure in a brilliant, clean blue flame. "Ignition confirmed," someone called out. The telemetry on the screens was perfect. All numbers were green. Elena watched the primary thrust indicator, her breath held tight in her chest. Simile. The engine screamed, a beautiful, terrifying sound of immense controlled power. They soared past the old 90% failure point, the point where the engine used to tear itself apart. A wave of relieved laughter and cheers rippled through the control room. 91%, 92%. Thorne read out the numbers, her voice steady but unable to hide a note of triumph. "All systems stable. The manifold is holding. Thermal load is well within design parameters." It was working. Her design, her beautiful, simple, impossible design was working. She felt a surge of profound, dizzying vindication, and then at 93% thrust, hell broke loose. It started not as a bang, but as a new sound. A high-frequency metallic scream that sliced through the engine's roar like a shard of glass. Every head in the control room snapped toward the screens. "What was that?" Ben yelled. Alarms blared, a cacophony of electronic shrieks. The telemetry on the screens went wild, numbers flashing from green to red in an instant. "Unforeseen harmonic resonance," Thorne shouted, her professional calm shattering. "Secondary frequency, it's off the charts. It's shaking the turbopump housing." The flawless blue flame sputtered, turning a sickly orange. Elena watched in horror as the manifold, her beautiful creation, began to glow a deadly cherry red. It wasn't sublimating. Her cooling system was holding, but the vibration was a force of nature they hadn't accounted for. A web of black fractures spread across the glowing metal like cracks in a sheet of ice. Then with a final deafening bang, a section of the manifold ruptured. The camera feed filled with a violent, instantaneous cloud of white vapor as the supercooled liquid methane hit the superheated exhaust. The screen went to static. The sudden, deafening silence that followed the explosion was worse than the noise. The engine was dead. Smoke billowed from the wreckage on the distant test stand. In the control room, the only sounds were the dying echoes of the alarms and the sharp, ragged sound of 30 people breathing at once. Elena stared at the static-filled screen, her mind a complete blank. The triumph of a moment ago had evaporated, replaced by a cold, leaden feeling of absolute failure. Her perfect solution, her moment of vindication, had just spectacularly disintegrated on a live feed in front of the company's entire leadership. The board members were already filing out, their faces grim, muttering to each other. Julian Croft remained at the back of the room, his expression completely unreadable, which was somehow more terrifying than anger. One by one, Her team members turned away from their consoles, avoiding her eyes, their faces etched with disappointment and the ghost of their old skepticism. The whispers started, low and venomous. Too simple. Not enough redundancies. A one-hit wonder. She stood beside Elena, both of them staring at the image of the smoking wreckage that had replaced the static. "This," Thorne said, her voice quiet, devoid of triumph or malice, filled only with a grim professional finality, "is the difference between theory and the real world, Elena. Your design was brilliant theoretically, but perhaps it was too simple. It lacked the redundancies of our original models. The desert doesn't care how elegant an equation is." It was the dispassionate assessment of a superior, confirming all of Elena's deepest, darkest fears. She was a fraud, a waitress who had gotten lucky once. She was out of her depth. Later that night, Eleanor sat alone in her silent, luxurious suite. She had not spoken to anyone since the test. Julian had not called. She stared out the massive window at the star-dusted desert sky, the same sky she had once dreamed of conquering. Now it just seemed to mock her, a vast, empty void. The confidence she had painstakingly rebuilt over the last 3 months was gone, shattered into a million pieces along with her engine. The voice of the imposter was back, and this time it was screaming. All the old condescension, all the sneers of people like Mr. Davies, all the pitying looks, they all came rushing back, a tidal wave of self-doubt that threatened to pull her under for good. Her entire future, her partnership with Julian, her team's fragile, newly won trust, it had all gone up in a cloud of smoke, and she had no idea how to fix it. The silence of Elena's suite was a living accusation. For 12 hours after the failed test, she sat on the edge of her perfectly made bed, staring out at the unforgiving beauty of the desert. The setting sun painted the sky in brutal hues of orange and red, the colors of fire and explosion. She replayed the final moments of the test in her mind 1,000 times. The triumphant cheers turning to shouts of alarm, the clean blue flame turning to a sickening orange, the beautiful, intricate machine tearing itself apart. Yes, sir. Thorne's words echoed in the stillness. This is the difference between theory and the real world. The whispers from the team followed. Too simple. One-hit wonder, waitress. Every fear she had wrestled with, every insecurity she had fought to overcome, came flooding back, a toxic tide that threatened to drown her. Julian hadn't called. The board was silent. She was adrift in a sea of failure, and the shoreline of her old life, safe, predictable, and soul-crushing, seemed to be calling her back. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had just gotten lucky once. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She ignored it. It buzzed again. With a weary sigh, she picked it up, expecting a summons from Julian to inform her that her flight back to Austin was ready. But it was a text from Sophia. There were no words of encouragement, no questions. It was just a picture. A grainy photo of her father, sitting up in a chair by a window in his room at the care facility, a small, stubborn smile on his face. The facility had sent it to Sophia that afternoon. He looked better than he had in months. Elena stared at the photo, at the man whose entire life had been about fixing what was broken. She remembered his hands, calloused and stained, patiently resoldering a broken connection on a circuit board. She remembered his favorite saying, the one he'd repeat after every seemingly catastrophic failure of a machine they were trying to fix. "Things are made to be broken, Mija. It's a gift. They break to show you their secrets, to teach you how to build them stronger." The wreckage on the test stand wasn't a tombstone. It was a textbook. The engine hadn't just failed. It had spoken to them in the only language it knew, the language of catastrophic, undeniable data. And she, the project lead, was hiding from it in a fancy hotel room. A new fire, born from the ashes of her self-pity, began to burn in her chest. She stood up, her movements now sharp and decisive. She splashed cold water on her face, pulled her hair back into a tight, functional ponytail, and walked out the door. She didn't go to the control room or the conference room. She strode directly to the main hangar, and then to the massive sealed doors of the wreckage bay. She keyed in a command. "Summon the entire Daedalus team. All personnel, engineers, technicians, everyone, to the wreckage bay. Now! They gathered in a loose, uncomfortable semicircle around the mangled remains of the prototype. The engine, their great hope, was a twisted, blackened sculpture of failure. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt fuel and vaporized metal. Elena walked to the front and stood before the wreckage, forcing them all to look at it, to confront the disaster they had all been avoiding. She let the heavy, funereal silence hang in the air for a long moment before she spoke. "My design was flawed," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the cavernous space. "There were no excuses, no qualifications. I missed the secondary harmonic resonance. I focused so intently on the thermal problem that I was blind to the vibrational one. This failure," she gestured to the twisted metal, "started with me. This is my responsibility." Every eye in the bay was locked on her. She had their full, undivided attention. "But I was not the only one who missed it," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the team, meeting the eyes of Thorne, of Ben, of Dr. Chen. "We all did. We were so relieved to have solved the first problem that we didn't look hard enough for the next one. This failure doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to all of us. It's not a symbol of our failure. It's a roadmap to our success. It is telling us exactly what we need to do. Our job, starting right now, is to listen to it. This failure belongs to all of us, and so will the solution." The despair that had choked the team was replaced by a flicker of something new, something fierce. She turned and pointed to a massive, rolling whiteboard someone had moved to the side. "Let's get to work." She didn't use the old hierarchy. She created new, agile phoenix teams, named for the task of rising from the ashes. "Ben," she called out, "you saw the resonance first. You lead the harmonics team. I want a full vibrational profile of the entire fuel flow system by tomorrow morning. Tear it all apart." Ben, who had been avoiding her gaze, looked up, a spark of his old arrogance now transformed into focused energy. He nodded sharply. "Dr. Chen, you're on materials. We need a new composite for the manifold housing, something with 10 times the vibrational dampening properties. Form a team. You have carte blanche." Finally, only Dr. Thorne was left. Eleanor turned to her harshest critic, her most formidable obstacle. "Dr. Thorne," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but carrying across the bay, "no one knows the structural limits and failure points of this engine better than you. I need you to lead the primary redesign, the core team. Find every weak point the resonance exposed, and then tell us how to build it stronger than we ever imagined." Eris Thorne stared at Elena, her expression unreadable. She looked at the determined faces of her engineers already starting to cluster around the whiteboard. She looked at the twisted wreckage. Then her gaze returned to Elena, the waitress who had refused to be broken. And for the first time, a look of genuine, unreserved respect dawned in her eyes. The ice didn't just melt, it evaporated. "We'll need to reinforce the turbo pump housing and redesign the injector mounts," Thorne said, her voice all business, already attacking the problem. "It will add 4% to the total mass." Thorne gave a single sharp nod. "We'll get it done." He had not called Elena because he had been waiting to see what she would do. He had seen leaders crumble under far less pressure. He watched as his broken, demoralized team was transformed in the space of 10 minutes into a focused, energized unit, swarming over the wreckage not like mourners, but like a team of surgeons saving a patient. And at the center of it all was Elena, coordinating, listening, her back straight, her voice clear, a commander taking charge of a battlefield. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. He had come to Atacaria looking for an answer to an engineering problem. He had found that, yes. But he had also found something far rarer and infinitely more valuable. He had found the leader Project Daedalus truly needed. The journey was far from over. The challenges ahead were immense. But as he watched Elena and Eris Thorne huddled over a whiteboard, their heads bent together in common purpose, he knew